I'm very excited to be moderating this panel with a very old friend, Senator Mark Warner, and someone I've admired for a very long time, former Admiral Mike Rogers. We're going to talk a little bit about the geopolitical implications of technology change. This is an on-the-record conversation. I'm sure the audience is very familiar with both of our panelists, but let me do some brief introductions just to remind everyone. Senator Warner was elected to the Senate in November 2008, now serves on the Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committee, as well as the Select Committee on Intelligence, where he's the vice chair. Among his legislative priorities, cybersecurity has remained at the forefront of the senator's work on and off the Hill. The senator's previous experience as an investor in the tech sector gave him a unique insight not only to the opportunities rapidly advancing tech presents to entrepreneurs and innovators, but also the very real risks that it poses to internet users, governments, and American national security. Recognizing the gap in the Senate's ability to address growing cyber threats, Senator Warner co-founded the bipartisan Senate Cybersecurity Caucus in 2016. And in doing this, he has created a platform for members of Congress to engage in this area of vital concern. In the aftermath of numerous costly hacks of public and private institutions, Senator Warner has led the call for improved protection of consumer privacy as well as for an expansion of government resources to put the country on a more secure footing. And most recently, actually on December 7th, Senator Warner put out a fabulous Cyber Doctrine. He did a speech, but also a paper, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that. Admiral Rogers has worked this issue from another angle. He has, until earlier this year, been the director of the National Security Agency and the second commander of the Defense Department's Cyber Command. In his previous capacity as the nation's chief defender in the cybersecurity space, Admiral Rogers has been instrumental in guiding the United States to develop a national strategy for cyber defense and in defending against the many attacks our nation sustains on a daily basis, out of sight, and for us, out of mind. He has worked diligently behind the scenes, defending the nation from the growing threat of information warfare and in developing doctrines and policies to shape how the United States deploys its own cyber capabilities. Though I am sure he would be the first to say we have a long way to go in building a robust and holistic national cyber strategy matched with the commensurate capabilities, I know all of us in this room are immensely grateful for his years of service. So thank you both for being here. I'd like to just quickly engage with Senator Warner on his most recent speech, the Cyber Doctrine. And I think we're all aware, it doesn't happen every day, but it happens more often than we like, almost once a week, that we hear some announcement by a tech company, a consumer company, someone with vital private information of ours to make life convenient, or to have access, or to be able to, do our own private business and our retail business. We find out that something bad has happened. Most recently, it was Starwood and Marriott. Previously, a long time ago, it was Yahoo. I remember when the Yahoo announcement came out, and they basically said that 15%, they thought, of their census of people, which was in the hundreds of millions, had been captured. I thought to myself, I wonder how long it'll be before they announce it's 100%. It was 18 months. Mm-hmm. But it was 100%, and it was pretty obvious to see from that point. And I think we now know that if they're given the time and the capabilities and the anonymity, everything will be taken. And that's the point of this kind of attack. So Senator Warner, tell us a little bit more about your cyber capability doctrine, what you are suggesting that we all understand and do from the government and Senate perspective.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ellen. It's great to see you again. I'm going to make a couple of opening comments. One, thanks to the Atlantic Council, Fred Kemp and others are having, I know my good friend Ankit Sai is here as well. A lot of what I have learned on this subject over the last 6 or 7 years. I learned from this guy right here. And this, Mike Rogers walking in, for years I would see him clean-cut, military uniform on. I think for those of you, anybody here in the venture or PE space, this guy looks like he's available for the next chapter. I've never seen yet Mike dressed this way, so it's great.
The new life.
The new life. Let me also, and I am going to answer the question, but put a little bit of context as well in terms of how almost kind of surreal some of this is. I think if we go back to the late 90s, current Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov at that point was Russia's representative to the UN. And even as early as the late 90s, Russia tried to start laying out at the international bodies saying there was a combination between cyber activities and misinformation and disinformation activities. They saw even that early a merger of those two domains. And frankly, for a long time, our country resisted linking those domains. And when we think about the 2016 incursion the Russians had into our democratic process, in many ways, they still maintained separateness of those two doctrines. There was the cyber effort to hack into the DNC and Podesta and others, and then weaponize that information through WikiLeaks. And then there was a separate misinformation, disinformation campaign utilizing the social media companies. And I mention all this because the Atlantic Council is, under Fred's leadership, beginning of this year, we said, let's see if we can bring together, because the Russian activities against us were not just against us. They'd practiced on their own people. They'd practiced on Ukraine. They'd practiced on the Baltics.
Brexit.
And we ended up bringing together parliamentarians from 13 different nations to talk about Russian cyber and other activities into their democratic process. And it was the most amazing day, because the day we held this meeting at the Atlantic Council offices here in Washington was the day that Donald Trump appeared with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. So you have all these parliamentarians talking about Russian cyber incursions into their nation at the very same moment that the President of the United States is kowtowing to a Russian dictator on the world stage. And part of our challenge as we think about cyber, and I do think that we will see a merger of cyber and disinformation, is the fact that this administration at the White House level has still not fully accepted both the threat and the responsibility. The president's appointments in the intel area, at DHS and elsewhere, these men and women get it, and I commend their hard work. But the idea that the fact that this White House got rid of a cyber officer in the White House, the fact that there was no national election security official put after the intervention in our election process are all signs of, if we don't have leadership at the top, this challenge that we face is much greater. The paper that I laid out had 3 or 4 basic points, and I will, in Sanities, try to be brief, which is an oxymoron. One is, I think we do need to acknowledge that we have not really had, even though Mike Rogers and others have tried to push us, we have not had a clearly articulated cyber doctrine in the 21st century. Right. We have not had an agreement that there ought to be international norms, that some cyber actions against our country or against any other Western country have to be met with not only defensive postures, but the potential use of offense. And one of the things the administration did do that I think was good was delegate down from the president to the Secretary of Defense the ability to make some of those determinations at a lower level than the White House, point number one. Point number two, we do need to think about with our allies, and if possible, even with our adversaries, what are those cyber activities that will demand a response, and not unlike chemical weapons or not unlike landmines, have the ability so that if an adversary attacks us, they know that we will respond. And I actually believe that while we have been willing to take on kind of secondary states like Iran and North Korea, the terrorists, we have been afraid of cyber escalation with near-peer adversaries because of our increasing technological dependence. I often have said, you know, you shut down Moscow's power for 24 hours, you got a problem. You shut down New York for 24 hours, you've got a global crisis. So we have to kind of reevaluate how we better prepare ourselves hygiene-wise, and also kind of alert the American public that we have these vulnerabilities. Many people have said we need, you know, what will only stir us to action is a cyber 9/11 or a cyber Pearl Harbor. I think that is completely wrong-headed. We are experiencing a level of cyber attacks on a daily basis where particularly these near-peer adversaries like Russia and China are bleeding us of our information, whether it's Marriott, whether it is manipulating social media through Russia on an absolute basis, on a daily basis. This audience would realize and recognize NotPetya. That was a one-day story in the popular press. Yet the cost to the world economy was in excess of $10 billion. And the increase in denial of service and ransomware attacks, not only against America, but across the world, has increased over 90% in the last year. And I've got a whole series of ideas. I will not make you endure all of them today, but one point I think, and this is where I'd love to get Admiral Rogers' view as well, is I worry, and I say this with some trepidation, coming from a state like Virginia where we are very, very proud of our broad-based support for our military. I think America needs to remain the strongest nation in the world economically, militarily, and actually, I would add, morally. But we just spent $716 billion on a defense budget. Russia spends $70 billion. China spends roughly $200 billion. I fear that we are buying way too much of the best 20th century military stuff in terms of tanks, planes, ships, and guns, when most of the conflict in the 21st century will be in the domains of cyber, misinformation, and space. And on a percentage basis, our near-peer adversaries in terms of Russia and China, even with much smaller defense budgets, are disproportionately spending in those domains of cyber and misinformation in particular. And then if you take the delta between what we spend and China spends on defense, where is China spending? Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, next generation 5G technology, which again, love to share with Mike on kind of what we need to do to make sure we don't get beat on the standards in that setting. Electric vehicles, they are taking a not equal role, but an attempt to be a leadership role in the technologies of the 21st century. So I think we need a fresh look at our national security policy. I think we need articulated norms and a defined cyber strategy. And I think we need to recognize that the next iteration of this battle will be where cyber and misinformation and disinformation combine, and we can talk about that later.
No, I think that's just great. So Mike, I like the new mic, by the way.
Yeah.
Welcome, and
thank you.
I wanted to pivot off what Senator Warner's been talking about, and obviously you've been the practitioner on this. And I just wanted to bring as an aside, in a part of my world as a public company director is cyber. And you know, I'm seeing increasingly with the kinds of attacks to grid and other things that law enforcement and the intelligence community, the United States government, doesn't really understand that public companies have different responsibilities. We're not agents of the government. So if you've got somebody crawling around your network and the government says, well, let's just keep them in there a while, let me watch, let me see what's going on. We don't have MOUs to take the responsibility from us, the legal responsibility to our shareholders. There's a whole piece of this, and I think you allude to this, Senator Warner, that we've got to have a bigger aperture and understanding of how to deal with this seriously. But if you could talk a little bit about, now that you've kind of
Sure.
emerged and are doing things in the commercial world, where do you think, what are your top 2 or 3 things you think we need to concentrate on?
So if I could, first, like Mark, just an overarching. When I left the government, I had 2 primary concerns in the national security region, largely shaped by my set of responsibilities as Cyber Command and the director of the National Security Agency. Number 1, I thought when I look at our adversaries around the world, they are focused on attempting to gain advantage over us in conflict and using capability short of direct armed conflict.
Right.
Look, they know that if they want to go head-to-head with us in a traditional military confrontation, we are going to win.
Right.
Now, I'm not going to argue it's going to be easy. I'm not going to argue it's going to be quick. But I look at them and I say to myself that many of the nation states of the world have come to the conclusion the way to gain advantage against the United States is to not trip the thresholds that generate an armed response for them. Rather, engage in behaviors at a lower risk level that don't trip a U.S. policy response, but still enable you to gain competitive advantage. So you look at, take the Russians as an example, you look at what they're doing with information, with cyber, the denial. Look, guys, you're seeing this play out. And this, I think, is the trend of the near term when I look over the next 10 years or so. I think, hey, this is going to be the norm for us. The second concern I had was, and it's very much in line with what Senator Warner was saying, I believe that we have not yet come to grips with what are the implications of technology in the digital age for a nation's security. And I don't just mean traditional, government role. What does economic competitiveness mean in this digital age that we're living in? As you're watching new technologies emerge, as you're watching non-US companies come to the forefront in the technical development, as you're watching nation states and groups make arguments in the global standards bodies that are resulting in outcomes that benefit them, not necessarily us. If you look at the way the US government is organized, I think to myself, guys, we are still in this industrial age. And I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. And I was part of this, and I kick myself now. Both as part of the Obama team and as the Trump team, I was involved in 2 separate efforts trying to define, so what is critical infrastructure? And when we first did this with the Obama team, and I was part of that, we thought very industrial output focused. So what manufacturing, petroleum, aviation, finance. We did not think about things like, so what are the processes that enable cohesion in this democracy we call America, like elections? We never even thought of that. Then, as I did this again as part of the Trump team, as we added that. The one thing that I thought to myself as I look back, guys, we did not fully think about what are the implications of data. As you're watching nation states invest in artificial intelligence technology, that capability is driven by 2 fundamental areas. Number 1, the power of your algorithms, and number 2, do you get the right amount of data? Do you get the right kind of data and the right amount of data? So it's not by chance you are now watching nation states out there going after data in huge concentrations, because now you've got the technical means to actually analyze it and generate value in a way that 5 or 10 years ago, somebody would have said to you, why as a nation state would I be interested in hotel reservation and credit card information? What would that do for me? Well, you look at it now and you're thinking, boy, I get financial information, I get travel patterns, I potentially get your passport number, you get a whole amount of identification data that potentially can be used and harvested using artificial intelligence and other means. So, my thought as I was leaving was we have got to step back and think about what are the implications of digital technology for our nation's security. And this prism that we have traditionally looked through in the industrial age where private sector has its own role, government has its own role, I'm going, guys, this is not going to work for us. You look at the way other nation states are bringing together the capabilities of their government, their academic institutions, their private sector, their research and development capabilities. I'm thinking, so tell me how you expect an individual US company, and it's not just US, I would argue the West in general, tell me how you expect individual corporations to gain competitive action or advantage when the competitor is not an individual company, it is now a company as part of a broader national strategy. That is really difficult, and I'm concerned that we have always counted on in the United States and in the West in general, our power is our values, our economy, and the power of our innovation. I agree with all of that, but I'm asking myself, does the model need to be reassessed in the 21st century? And the one that really concerns me is the innovation piece. Is it still enough to expect the private sector to do all this and gain innovation and innovative advantage all by itself? Mm-hmm. Think about the fact that we have spent literally everyone in their lives in this room, we have lived in the idea that the West and the United States generated technical capability at a level that gave us the forefront in the world. Think of the advantage that that incurred for us. We just take it for granted because we've lived this way for so long. Well, if we don't change some of these trends, that's not the world that our children and our grandchildren are going to find themselves in. Because my concern is if we don't do things differently, the way broadly the trends are going, I'm concerned that the model of the 20th century is not going to equate to the same level of advantage for us that it did.
So Senator Water brought up a good subject. Without a cyber 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, you know, we tend to react to things. We don't tend to take progressively the action we should in a preventive way. I wholly agree with everything both of you have said. This is a call to arms. This is about change. This is about not suiting up to play checkers when everybody's playing 3D chess. What do we have to do to reorient the national psyche? First of all, the government, the Congress, the executive branch, the military. What do we do, the corporate world? What do we do to, short of some cataclysmic event that causes everybody to seize, what do we do?
Well, again, as I said, this notion that we're going to have to wait for a cataclysmic event, those events are happening on a daily basis.
They are.
And that part is point number one. Point number two, and I really want to build off of what Mike just said, and share with you the evolution in my thinking. You know, a decade ago, both as a former governor and a tech business guy, you know, I kind of had, I think, what was part of the conventional wisdom crowd that United States vis-a-vis China, you know, bring China into the WTO, you know, the internet will be a empowering and democratizing entity, we will rise together. I remember, you know, Bill Clinton now infamous statement saying, oh, if China tried to regulate the internet, it's like nailing Jell-O to the wall. He was wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, China has shown that you can use the internet in a powerful way, but also as a way of enormous control. And what I think, starting in about 2015, as President Xi consolidated further power, as President Xi reimposed Communist Party control over all of the Chinese companies, particularly the Chinese tech companies. And as much as I got frustrations with Google, Facebook, and Twitter, I don't want them replaced by Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent. As we've seen China much more aggressively, whether it's Marriott or OPM, you know, steal our data, force tech transfer, and frankly, just to be equal opportunity offender for those of you who are American businesses in this country who are willing to say, I've got to be willing to give away our crown jewels to get into the Chinese market. No. I think you're doing an enormous disservice to our country. And I think we need to raise that concern. And what happened was the intelligence community, Mike Rogers included, for those of us on the committee, they were absolutely consistent, all branches of the IC, about this threat. And it just hit me, scaring the hell out of the 15 of us on the committee is only partially useful, because we do a disservice if we don't bring this message to you, and particularly to industry writ large. So one of the things that I've started with the assent of the intelligence community is to have the community be willing on a daily, on a one-off read-in basis to read in CEOs, CTOs, and others so they can get a classified brief on this threat. So I've started a roadshow, and I do it with a Republican senator. I've done it with Marco Rubio a couple times. I've done it with Richard Burr. I've done it with John Cornyn, because some of this was, let me be clear, this is not a Trump phenomena only. Some of this should have been done with Obama as president. And we bring along either the Director of National Intelligence or the deputy, senior people from the FBI, DHS, And we go through a couple-hour presentation, and we've done one in Austin, we've done one with the CTOs of BRT, we've done one with the venture community, we're about to do all the banks, we're trying to get the BRT CEO level. Interestingly enough, just again to put a shot across the bow, the community that has been most reluctant to even take this brief in a classified setting is some of our friends in private equity who have such large investments at this point in these Chinese companies that they don't want to hear the truth. But I think the starting point here is as an information campaign. Where this leads policy-wise, China's a great nation. China's will be an economy that will equal ours or surpass ours. They are already on scientific publications and on patents on a par. I am not saying a move into a new Cold War by any means, but I do think we need to think through this strategy. We have to think through the strategy of 350,000 Chinese students in America, where many of them mid-career are contacted by the Chinese services and basically told, if you want to come home, you got to come home with intellectual property stealing. So we need to think this through at a much, much higher level. But the first part is putting people on notice. Policy changes that we can make. One, I think we need to build out a international norms and an international coalition. The remarkable thing is the rest of the world, the Koreans, the Japanese, I think about our friends and the Australians who've been very bold on things like 5G technology. The Europeans were all waking up to this threat. And when Mr. Trump came in, he had a chance to build this international coalition to go to China and say, China, we want you to continue to be part of the world economy, but you got to play by the same set of rules. Right. You cannot have your companies not be responsible to their shareholders and their boards, but actually simply responsible to the government. But we missed that opportunity when the president instead said Canada's a national security threat. And my fear is that this president is going to trade away an additional $1 billion of soybean purchases and maybe give up the ability to have the international coalition on technology of the next generation. Two last points on this in terms of a rules-based. There is low-hanging fruit. And one of the things that Mike Rogers helped teach me, and in an area that just makes me crazy that we've not done this room, again, is all familiar with Internet of Things. We have purchased 4 to 5 billion Internet of Things connected devices. We think about we're going to have this great new security around our power grid, but the bad guys are going to come in through the microwave in the kitchen. And we've had for 2 years bipartisan legislation, House and Senate, to say with a very light touch, we ought to require at least government purchases of IoT connected devices, that there's minimum security, that they are patchable, that they do not have an embedded passcode, that if there's known vulnerabilities, we make those public. And much of industry has agreed. We've actually moved the chamber to neutral. Board of Software Alliance is supportive. But some of our vendors are reluctant to add, and we're talking about pennies on a device to increase basic security. So there would be a legislative function. I think the international coalition is a function. I think increasing, frankly, the fact that whether it was Marriott or whether it was Yahoo, the disclosure requirements. What are a material, I think it is a material fact when we have a company that has this level of security breach and they feel no obligation to report that to the market. I think it is abysmal, to say the least, that we have had 150 million Americans' personalized information stolen from sloppiness to Equifax, and that company has paid zero penalty. So whether we're talking about a different liability regime, whether we're talking about kicking the FTC to actually start doing stuff as opposed to being so passive, whether we're talking about idea about materiality in terms of data breach, whether we're talking about the basic idea that there ought to be national data breach notification legislation, there is a realm of areas where we can move. And the good news on all this, sorry to get a little bit excited in the morning here, the good news is none of this is Democrat or Republican. It is not liberal conservative. It is future past. And I think even with the challenges, there are a whole host of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that know we need to do this. And there are people in the mid-levels of the Trump administration who recognize this. I'm not sure out of the White House there's the same recognition.
I think that those are excellent points, Senator Warner. So Admiral Rogers, in this same vein of how do we create international norms, how do we do the minimum at least, or at least wave the flag to get people to understand that this isn't just about patching and hygiene. This is way beyond that, where materials becoming weaponized and having material effects on things like elections, the kind of soft side that we didn't necessarily understand before. What are your suggestions, and how do we, once again, raise the call without having a 9/11?
Right. So I have to admit, boy, I did Sony in November of 2014, and I was part of the policy discussions with the Obama team in the sit room with the president and others as we were trying to work our way through it. And I thought, this is when this is going to trip the threshold. Didn't. Not Petya. I'm with the Trump team now. It's not Petya, and I'm sitting same place, different cast of individuals, and I'm thinking, this is the one that's going to trip the threshold. If you just look at the magnitude, and I'm going, so what is it going to take? I'm still trying to figure this out in my own mind. I think broadly, there are some interesting historic analogies. When I was a kid growing up, automotive safety was something you just didn't care about. I can remember as a very little boy, there weren't seatbelts in cars. Cars weren't incentivized for automotive safety as a core design characteristics. It didn't impact your insurance. There were little regulations with manufacturers. And I look at the trajectory of how safety in automobiles have changed over the last 50 years through a combination of, we use the private market to incentivize consumer choice. Hey, if you buy a car that is identified as safer than another one, we'll give you lower insurance. We incentivize automobile manufacturers. So there's a market that perhaps is looking for greater safety. Maybe they get better consumer choice out of it. Perhaps I could do that. We came up with a set of government regulations that took the incentives to, hey, these are now mandatory minimums because we believe automotive safety is a social good, and it's important enough given the amount of cars that we have in our society. We're going to do some choices that in fact are going to drive this. I look at aviation, for example. We came to the conclusion as a nation that aviation safety was of such significance that we would create a government structure and discipline that turned any aviation accident into a process that was studied independently. All findings are publicly published, and the findings then translate to actions to manufacturers, training for pilots, actions on the part of the companies. And to Mark's point, it used to frustrate me as a guy who not only penetrated networks but defended networks. Why can't, for example, I train against some of the same things that are happening to pick the company, but we never talk to each other? So I look at some of the models that are out there and I say to myself, there are ways to incentivize this, but we've got to come to the conclusion that cybersecurity is a national good and that therefore we are willing to impose by consumer action as well as by government action, we're willing to impose a series of minimums. Underwriter Lab, when I was a kid growing up, hey, didn't matter if it was an extension cord. Hey, this thing had been tested to a minimum safety standard and had the nice tape on it that said, hey, the Underwriter Laboratory guaranteed that this met basic safety concerns. I'm going, can't there be an equivalent for cybersecurity at a minimal level? Because as the senator said, I used to tell the Hill, if you think we have challenges now, the longer we wait to deal with this, the sunk cost that'll be out there in terms of the Internet of Things, it will become economically unviable for us to go back and try to make wholesale changes in hundreds of millions of devices that are proliferated around our society and around the world. Time is not working for us here. It is working against us. And we cannot wait. This idea we're going to wait for some traumatic event, I'm thinking, oh,
well,
God,
so this is an absence of national leadership.
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
One of the things that drove this home to us on the committee, and Tom Cotton and I have a lot of areas where we don't agree, but on issues like this, we have total agreement. We sat in the Intel committee for close to 4.5 years, listening about the vulnerabilities in the Russian-based company Kaspersky Labs. It took us 4 years to get Kaspersky Labs off the GSA acquisition list, even though the community knew it was vulnerable.
Right.
You know, when we are thinking, as Mike just said, the amount of cost it will take to rip out or change over all of these IoT-connected devices, or even more challenging back in my old field as we think about embedded equipment with Huawei and ZTE into our networks, you know, my gosh, we are just, it's crazy that we don't build in some of this security on the front end.
And one other point. You know, one thing I say, I said this when I was in government, I'm saying this now when I'm outside the government to the private sector, it's not in your interest to wait for a Pearl Harbor-like event, some trauma. Because in the aftermath of trauma, history would suggest we don't always make the best choices in the immediate aftermath of major calamity. So rather than having something jammed down your throat by people like me in my previous life in Washington, it's in your best interest to try to come together collectively as industries and try to come up with some minimum standards that you can believe that are a starting point.
Right.
This will evolve over time. It's just like that automotive safety. We did this incrementally over time. We didn't wake up one day and said, hey, within the next 5 years, we're going to guarantee.
And it doesn't need to be, and I think people think that whatever kind of standard we will put in place will be so static that technology will outrace it. I was in this business. I get the fact that static regulatory is not the right model here. But there can be evolutionary standards. There can be, you know, even industry-written standards. I mean, I'm not sure that the FINRA model to securities is exactly right, but that notion of there might be an industry front end where you have a government back end if there's, you know, way over the top abuse, or an idea that we ought to explore.
There have to be adaptable guardrails so that we at least can create the contours of what good behavior is. I mean, right now, I think part of our problem is the definition of good behavior is behind a screen. People don't get to see enough of that, and they don't even know what bad behavior is because we've really hidden it from them.
It also plays to our strengths. In general, the private sector tends to generate better solution sets than government imposed. So I'm saying, can't we play to our strengths as a nation? Those things that got us here, let's turn them to our advantage to make sure we maintain this competitiveness.
Well, we've got so many smart people here. I know that there are this has been a provocative conversation. Let's get some questions. If we can get the mics up here. Okay? We have a question right here.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, Senator. I'm Alexis Crow. I lead the geopolitical practice at PwC and a senior fellow at Columbia Business School. I want to touch on something the Admiral mentioned, which is this our accustomed sort of position to innovation and being the world's leaders in innovation in the world in America. And if I look back to some of the most groundbreaking advances in technology, it's been born out of the military national defense apparatus, whether it's going back to California in the 1950s, you know, the industry that employed Steve Jobs' father, GPS, the fact that some of the greatest advances in renewable energy were on the SWAT territories when our tanks were being bombed and, you know, troops in Afghanistan actually needed to power their trucks. The question remains that if we are to consider ways in which the government might support innovation in the 21st century, I wonder if we're moving out of the digital era and into something else where we need to address challenges to complex demographic issues, such as natural disasters, such as infrastructure, such as logistics. And I wonder whether or not there would be any kind of appetite for the US government to start to support innovation in these kinds of areas in a way that the Israelis have actually done and moved out of, you know, with their programs like Yozma, have moved out of the national security apparatus and into things like smart transport. Would that be possible?
I mean, take a stab. I think yes, but I would have these conversations in Estonia. I'd have these conversations in Tel Aviv where I would remind them, look, we've got to come up with solutions that scale to a nation of 335 million. That's the largest economy in the world. I'm not trying to minimize the value of their experience, but what I would say to them is, it works within your structure. We have to figure out how we make this work within our structure. So just blanket copying, I'm not sure this is going to work. I do agree, though, broadly, I wish we could start small, pick a set of what we think are going to be core technologies, core capabilities that will enable economic competitiveness for our nation in the 21st century, and ask ourselves, how can we build partnerships between government and the private sector to work this? Because quite frankly, that is what many of our competitors around the world are doing.
Mm-hmm. Let me take a crack at this as well. I'm not sure that the best model is that all of our research capabilities has to go through the DoD budget. Mm-hmm. You know, it's ironic. You know, in many ways, some of the best, and we've not mentioned, you know, climate change yet. Some of the best work on climate is actually being done by the Navy, but we don't call it climate change, we call it sea level rise. So whatever we got to call it, that's fine with me to be politically correct if we're making some of the research. But if you look at the domestic discretionary budget, where, you know, National Academy of Sciences, NIH, host of others, where traditionally that's been where a lot of our research was done. You know, we are, the current American business plan, again, I don't care Democrat, Republican, we are down to, for every dollar you send to Washington, 7 cents is the total that is spent on education, infrastructure, and research and development. I would never invest in an enterprise that only spends 7 cents on those items. That does not count the money that is spent on research on the defense side of the house. But within traditional education, infrastructure, and R&D, we are at all-time lows and going lower. And then what Mike mentioned earlier, in terms of China, China has an industrial policy. President Xi, China 2025, has laid out in a host of areas where they intend to be world leaders. And Kai-Fu Lee, who's written, I think, a fascinating book on artificial intelligence, makes at least the case, and I think there's a debate, but it's not a debate we ought to have, that is, to the point earlier, why would any country want to amass all this data? If the total volume of data that you can amass is one of your assets, and you start with our 300 million versus China's 1.3 billion basic N, you add on top of the fact that their companies have total sharing of all their information with the Chinese government, and I can guarantee you Google, Facebook, Twitter, et al. Do not share with the US government on those same levels, and you accept the notion that in basic computing power, just raw power, that they are approaching us and in certain areas passing us. And to some level, you know, people will say, well, our engineers are better than their engineers, but they'll say, but theirs are getting better. Our patents are better than theirs, but their patents are getting better. Their trajectory upwards versus our kind of flat does not mean, and Admiral Rogers said this, and I think this is, again, kind of one of those aha moments. We have lived in a world where every technological advantage was either originated in America or in the West. And all the standards that went around that innovation was developed in America or in the West. On the area, for example, of 5G, which will be the network that connects all the Internet of Things devices, because the Chinese are flooding the zone in these international standards bodies, we're still okay today, but I'm not sure we're going to be okay by the end of 2019 and 2020.
And it's not the Chinese intention that we are.
And it's not and so one of the things I've been trying to do is at least get, and we have no longer, in the telecom space, we have no longer an American provider. Right. You know, we've got to rely on, and they're good companies, Ericsson, you know, or Nokia or Samsung, but the West writ large needs to have more conversations at both the governmental and the corporate level about, you know, how we share and make sure that we continue to at least maintain parity in these new technologies.
So we have about 5 or 6 minutes left. I want to do a lightning round of at least 3 questions. So General?
That means I can't answer because I can't.
No, you can. and then you?
I don't think I need Mike Davis, or Senator, or Mike. As we go forward, we're
There is one.
We're starting to talk more about offensive a little bit, just like we did with space. You couldn't talk about offensive in space, and all of a sudden it's a big issue. Would you talk a little bit about ambiguity versus declared policy on response and what you see, what we should do there?
No, I'll leave that to Admiral Rogers. No, I do. Listen, I think that it has been open season from our near-peer adversaries in terms of Russia and China attacking us because they know we have not wanted to go into cyber escalation.
Right.
And I think we need to change that, but how we get that right, I would lead to folks like Mike, and I would think the space analogy makes total sense to me because it feels to me, it's another area I spent a lot of time, that for 30 years, the IC and the Air Force thought that America was going to control space entirely. It was like nobody in our community ever saw a James Bond movie. Because we all remember, if you go back to the 1960s, the bad guys would always send a laser beam or something to blow up a satellite. Now that that's a reality, we've had to rethink our whole resilience and framework around space. We need to do the same thing on cyber.
So, I mean, we found ourselves, what I found frustrating, and I actually said this one of the particular last senior sessions I was at, you look at other nations of the world have come to the conclusion that cyber offers lower risk because it doesn't trigger a escalatory response on the part of the victim and the nation state that the victim is part of. We were at the opposite end of the spectrum. Right. Hey, use of cyber leads to escalation. And my comment was, how could we're living in this world where we're watching our adversaries and competitors use this as a way to gain advantage, and we've come to the conclusion that this is all risk. Guys, I totally reject that premise.
Right.
My view was everybody in the world lives in a glass house right now. We would constantly talk about this glass house we lived in, and I would say to myself, what do you think the Russian and Chinese homes are made out of? They are founded on many of the same things we are. Now, we're probably at a greater level in many ways, but so the argument that I tried to make was we need to ask ourselves, what can we do to change the strategic calculus of many of these competitors to convince them that, in fact, aggressive use of cyber is not low risk, that, in fact, it has the potential to trigger escalation or response.
That's right.
We got to change that dynamic. I argued one of the ways to do that was by starting off basically constantly telling the world about what we're not going to do. I said, if I'm sitting in Moscow or Beijing right now, I love what I'm hearing. Yeah. Because it says to me, so I'm not going to hit a threshold with these guys. I keep doing it. My argument was, what we ought to say is, we believe cyber is one set of capabilities among the whole host that we have as a nation. That just as we are committed to the ability to generate capability in the nuclear world, in the space world, to harness the power of our economic capabilities, to harness the rule of law, sanctions, indictments, we should be saying that we view cyber as a tool that we are prepared to use at the time and place of our choosing. That it isn't necessarily our first choice, but if we believe it is appropriate, we are prepared. And one of the other implications of that is, let's start talking about capabilities.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And let's show people a little bit, hey, look, this is why you don't want to go down this road. I'm glad to see the trends from a policy perspective are going in the right direction. I mean, one of my frustrations with PPD 20 was we have gotten to a place where we are allowing everybody to say no and only a handful to say yes. Could we invert this model? It ought to be you give a small number of people, you don't allow everybody to say no. Mm-hmm. Empower a very specifically well-defined set of individuals that can say yes, but stop everybody else from saying no, because anybody in the bureaucracy at one point, if they wanted to say no, everything ground to a halt. And I just thought, you cannot develop capabilities, you cannot change your doctrine, you cannot convince opponents that you have both capability and potential intent, because that's the power behind the nuclear piece. Hey, the Americans have capability, and they're very clear in their intent about what trips a threshold and when they might be prepared to use this. And the Americans are very direct. We don't want to use nuclear weapons, but
we have an articulated doctrine.
We have a capability and we have a doctrine on which we're going to use them. Right. I think we need to be thinking about cyber in some of the same ways. Lastly, please don't take from my comments that Rogers was a guy who was constantly arguing, we got to hit him with cyber, we got to hit him with cyber. Far from it. My argument was, just because somebody comes at us in cyber doesn't mean we have to respond the same way. View cyber as one tool.
Right.
and step back and ask yourself, given all the tools I have, what's the one that makes,
But keep it
that
in the
makes the
toolbox.
most sense?
But keep it in the
Keep it
toolbox
in
and
the
not have it
toolbox.
exempt. Right. We have time for one question in the back. Yes.
Thank you. Dustin Volz with Wall Street Journal. Admiral, good to see that your post-government beard is still looking good. Just a quick question.
He looks like a tech guy.
Now, my wife does not say that,
I think his,
though.
entrepreneurs here in the room ought to sign him up.
Quick question. Huawei came up earlier. We hear a lot about how supply chain risk is one of the most serious issues in cybersecurity. You talk about that. You talk about China. That leads to Huawei. Admiral Rogers, I would like for you to can you assess on the hierarchy of risks that the country is facing from a national security perspective, where would you rank the Huawei issue? And quick follow-up to that, if it is such a serious threat as some policymakers and others are now telling us, why is there not a push to declassify some of the intelligence, the sources and methods that might be able to demonstrate that to our allies, to lawmakers, to the public, to companies, that this is something that needs to be taken seriously? Senator Warner mentioned the Kaspersky example earlier, how that took 4, 5, 6 years before action was taken. We've seen a similar dynamic on Huawei. So I'd like to hear, why not actually declassify a source or a method at a time when we have more sources and methods than ever before? Thank you.
So let me really focus on the first part, because the second part really boils down to a policy question. I'm not part of the process anymore, although I will tell you at times I ask myself, so how much more data do you have to have out there to convince you of this? I mean, part of me is, look, this is not so much a lack of insider data and much more about, well, what does it really mean? The part about the supply chain piece, I tell people, look, step back, don't focus on any one entity here. In this, again, one of those implications of how do you maintain competitive advantage and what does national security mean in the world of this digital age? One of the implications to me is you have got, and we thought about this in DOD, I would argue you need to think about in the private sector. So what is my supply chain? When I in the DOD would go to some of our companies, I would be amazed with, they would rattle off their primary subs. And I'd say, that's not what I asked you. What I asked you was, I want to get down and talk in detail about your supply chain. So tell me where your firmware, your software, and your hardware is coming from. Not just your primary subs, who's writing the code, where is it being written, what kind of verification regimes do you have in place? Talk to me about your distribution in terms of parts and components. Now, you can't do this with everything. So one of the things, and you saw us do this in DOD, we take a different approach in the nuclear area where we think the risk is really high than we do in some areas. My comment would be, what the private sector, I think, and government could be a part of this, we need to take a risk-based approach here, decide those areas where compromise offers the greatest potential risk to the ability to generate whatever the business outcome service that you generate as a company, and then walk yourself through and say, so what does my supply chain look like, and what are the mechanisms I can put in place to give me greater confidence? I don't think, for example, it's going to be, I want to physically inspect and verify every component that goes into a system I make. That's not realistic. But what if we said, look, as part of the contract you're going to have with me as a supplier or a sub, the contract's going to read that I have the authority to do random inspections at any production place. What if the contract said I can pull components off the assembly line at any time and do inspections? What if it said, hey, look, I can do independent software validations on any software programs in the following areas that you're writing? That you could scale, that you could do without grinding this whole thing to a halt. So I just think we need to take a risk-based approach, and we got to ask ourselves, what are solutions that can scale in this global economy that we're all a part of?
Let me just add 3 quick points to that. One, I think there's a lot we can learn from our Australian friends. I think the process they went through and the solution set they came to was an elegant one that we can learn from. 2, the question of getting the community in certain settings to be willing to do one-day read-ins and share with the business community some of these risks at a level that we can't share here. We are in the process of doing. And 3, what my concern is, and not to flip back to 5G, is that even if we first generation on Five Eyes and other European allies, for example, in Korea and others, end up with Western-based equipment, If the other 70 to 75% of the world ends up with standards driven by China and Huawei and ZTE, we may win the first generation war, but we're not going to win the second and third generation follow-ons because the market is going to simply drive us that way. I mean, for any of you old techies in the room, I remember the CDMA, TDMA debate, and when Qualcomm won that, Motorola didn't realize it was walking dead.
Right.
But that's what I fear in terms of the iterations in this area.
Well, I think we could go on for another hour at least, and I want to thank both Senator Warner and Admiral Rogers for their leadership and their intellect and calling to arms on a very, very important issue. I don't think we solved it today. I think a lot of people in this room are going to have to help, but we don't want to be the thing between you and lunch. So join me in thanking Senator Warner and Admiral Rogers, and thank you all very much.